The full impact of continuing resolutions is hard to pin down for the Defense Department, but a government watchdog says the funding lapses consistently lead to delays, higher costs, added administrative work, and operational disruptions, including a facility sustainment contract at Joint Base San Antonio that more than doubled after CR-related delays. They also disrupted training and exercises and forced financial staff to rework budgets to navigate CR limits instead of supporting the mission. For more, Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis spoke with Rashmi Agarwal, a director on the Government Accountability Office's Defense Capabilities and Management team.
We were requested by Congress through a provision in the Senate report accompanying the NDAA to really understand what were the specific effects of CRs on DoD operation and maintenance activities and acquisition programs. So this report really describes the effects of selected DoD activities and programs, and we do a deep dive into those particular activities and programs.
How did you decide what activities and programs to include in this sample? Because you're only looking at certain programs here.
Given kind of the direction that we had in the provision that I mentioned, we selected a sample of operation and maintenance activities and acquisition programs that we determined were likely to be affected by CRs and that were aligned with DoD's strategic priorities. So our goal was in selecting these activities and programs was to provide illustrative examples of how DoD activities and programs were specifically affected by CRs. And so these selected activities and programs are critical to DoD's national security mission.
Let's dive into those examples. Could you first talk about some of those activities and programs that you surveyed that were impacted by CRs? But also, did you find that some programs were maybe insulated from the impacts of CRs?
Let me give you some context. In terms of the types of operations and maintenance activities we reviewed, we looked at things like facilities, sustainment, joint exercises, and unit training. And in terms of the acquisition programs, we looked at things including Air Force aircraft, Army ammunition, and Space Force and Navy missile defense systems. So we did find that while the effects vary, nearly every activity and program we reviewed experienced some sort of effect. It could be a direct effect or an indirect effect from CRs. So acquisition programs face really direct constraints. So not just being held to prior year funding levels, but also not being able to start new programs or make changes to things like production rates. Additionally, some of the operation and maintenance activities we looked at, like facilities and maintenance, also faced more significant constraints like from the CR. So for example, Navy officials that said CRs led to delays in awarding Navy ship maintenance contracts. And Army officials we spoke with said there were delays in the work at Army maintenance depots.
Is there a mechanism by which you could measure which programs are most affected?
That is a really good question because available data really were not available and do not allow for a precise measure of the extent of the effects of CRs on DoD operations in many cases. So where we could find specific examples, for example, with contract costs, we included that information.
As for contract costs, could you talk about what are some of the primary drivers of those cost increases when DoD operates under a CR?
We found that, those cost increases can come from a variety of sources. So for some of the acquisition programs, CRs led to placing smaller orders over the course of the year and not being able to take advantage of better pricing. In addition, there could be increased costs due to inflation, changes in foreign exchange rates, or vendors just needing more time to complete work in a compressed time frame. So, for example, officials that we talked to at Joint Base San Antonio reported that CR delays led to an average increased contract cost of 66%, including some projects where the cost more than doubled.
There are also spending challenges. Could you talk about which programs were most affected there? What did you find there?
I think the main takeaway there is that CRs can lead to uneven spending over the course of the fiscal year. So CRs create uncertainty for agencies about when they're going to receive their final appropriation and also what the final funding amount is going to be and how much funding is going to be available to them. So what we were finding is that as a result of CRs, spending is often more limited earlier in the fiscal year, simply because they just don't know how much funding they have. And then it has to increase later in the fiscal year after a regular appropriation passes. So when that happens, we found that, activities and programs can still face constraints in being able to spend the funding that they have available. So, for example, going back to contracting, the contracting offices may not have the capacity to solicit and award all the contracts that need to be awarded, or vendors may not have the capacity to complete all the projects that need to be completed.
The Defense Department operated under a full-year continuing resolution last year. How did operating under a full-year CR impact the Defense Department in comparison to operating under a short-term CR?
For the scope of our review, we did not look specifically at how a full-year CR affected the department. It wasn't within the time frame of our review, but our report does note some of the ways that last year's full-year CR differed from traditional CRs, including the ability to have new starts. That is not typical under a traditional CR, but that was available to the department last year. We did look at the differences between shorter and longer CR periods and found that longer CR periods, so those would be periods that last 3 months or longer of the fiscal year, led to slower obligation rates, meaning they couldn't commit to spending as quickly early on in the fiscal year, specifically, I would say, for acquisition-related appropriations. So that means that when these programs received a regular appropriation, they had a shorter time frame to obligate the rest of their funding by the end of the fiscal year. Longer CRs also then tend to amplify some of the challenges that I talked about earlier with bottlenecks that programs and activities face as they're hitting that end of the fiscal year timeline. So like I mentioned before, time for awarding contracts and vendors being able to complete activities, that time frame is compressed.
Based on the work that you've done here, what are some additional reporting mechanisms that could enable a more comprehensive assessment of CR-related impacts across the department?
I think if the department takes action on the DoD Inspector General's recommendation, they are going to obtain that data, whether it's cost data in terms of the contracts that got extended as a result of CRs, for example. But I think if they take action on that recommendation, that would enable a better assessment of the CR-related impacts.
That's the Government Accountability Office's Rashmi Agarwal speaking with Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. You can find Anastasia's story at federalnewsnetwork.com.